Well, let me
But
ask you this: what was when these stories are spun, right? I mean, are they? I imagine some people sincerely believe them, but what, from the perspective of wealthy people in the John Birch Society, let's say, what is the value of us being pegged to gold, or what is the value of? I mean, why do they have a problem? What's the real problem they have with the Fed, as opposed to sort of like the stories that are built around it, or is it? Do they all sincerely believe it's just simply a way to filter money to the Jews?
this is a question I have asked myself, and I've tried to do some research into it, and it is really unclear to me. I think that there definitely is, to some extent, some of these wealthy people have a lot of their money in these hard assets, right? And so they are simply defending the assets that they have. Um, the the At least the way I read it, I think this is a very useful form of political discourse that they have that may not be all that directly about the it may not be that they care that much about the specific interest rates policies of the Fed. Now, I do know that they would like to get rid of the Fed altogether, and it's hard for me to imagine what our economy would be like without central banking. And maybe they would benefit from it in some way that I don't fully understand. But I think that's an open question. I mean, it is the case that, as we talked about before, right, that there are a lot of people out there selling gold and platinum and silver. They happen to be on Alex Jones and other places like that, and they certainly have an interest in telling us that, gold is the real hard asset and we don't want to be in the dollar and so forth.
Right. And these things aren't mutually exclusive. I mean,
Right. No.
they will enhance each other's. Your ability to believe that gold is really important, and also coincidentally having a garage full of gold, is they're related. All right. So
Right.
so okay. So with that said, what else about Bitcoin is an expression of right wing extremism?
Um, I really focus on the economic aspects because that is just where you happen to see this really significant overlap between the what I think is properly called extremism. It just so happens that the people who promote these views just tend to be very far to the right. I think a little bit less extreme, but still of real concern, is the anti-government bias that is even more prominent in the Bitcoin community, right? And to me, that is simply like hard right as opposed to the extreme right, those hard libertarian right or whatever. But when Bitcoin talks about decentralization or eliminating the middleman or getting rid of regulation, all they are talking about all the time is government and how evil government is and how government is, a corrupt thing that, again, exists to benefit the bankers or whatever. And their solution is to get rid of it, which I think is which is just like what we've heard from the GOP with regard to 2008, right, where you had a crisis that was largely caused by deregulation, and the solution they proposed was even more deregulation instead of regulation, which, in my opinion at least, is the thing that would help to prevent it.
So it's not just that that people who that 8 out of 10 Bitcoin supporters are espousing a certain right-wing perspective. It is that the concept of Bitcoin is and these other cryptocurrencies is founded in an extreme distrust of the state and a belief that somehow a currency can function without without being tethered to a state and without having any regulation other than the behavior of everybody who is using Bitcoin.
You've said it very well. And in fact, I can add a little bit, which is we talk about blockchain, right? And there are these discussions of non-currency functions of blockchain. And the most famous one is called smart contracts. And the idea is that you would be able to write a contract and put it out on the blockchain, and then it would be self-executing. It would execute via machine algorithms, and there would be no need for lawyers or judges to intervene in that process at all. And again, there is a desire to eliminate what most of us would say, even if it's very cumbersome, but is a really important function in society, that, the relationship between lawyers and judges and so forth and legislatures, and they would just like to get rid of it. There is people have written some good papers about the social function played by lawyers and judges and so forth, and how just eliminating this is just really distasteful.
Well, it's also, there has to be a way to adjudicate and to and arbitrate these things. I've had conversations with libertarian thinkers and intellectuals, I guess, that have proposed the idea of my court, their court, and then a third court to adjudicate the results from these separate courts. Which, yes, was my response as well. But in this instance, what? All right. So, I don't understand, where is the idea that Bitcoin is going to supplant currencies? What is supposed to happen with? Listen, I have no problem with these things being commodities. I had baseball cards. That's great. And
right.
But what is supposed to happen? How does this continue to maintain value? How does it edge out existing currencies, right? Because if this is a state-free currency, my understanding is our money maintains its value because the state has a monopoly of force and says, you need to pay taxes. We will only take taxes in the form of American US dollars, and therefore it has value, because if you don't give it to us, you go to jail. And so everybody's going to agree to take this because everybody owes us some taxes to pay their dues to society. Where will Bitcoin get its value if it's not volatile? If it is just a system where will it get its value?
Right. This is a huge problem, right? And some of the more thoughtful Bitcoin people have started to admit that this hugely exploding value is actually, contradicts its desire to function as a currency. And so there is a little movement now to develop what they're calling stable coins, a coin that would have the same value all the time and that could function as a currency. And I can't technically evaluate the proposals. I guess we'll wait and see if they work. But it is hard to understand how people are incented to keep running this network when the coins themselves may never be worth more than they are worth at any given time.
That's the thing, is that, as far as I can tell, the primary driver at this point of interest in Bitcoin is that, I want to buy it when it's, one Bitcoin is worth $8,000 and wait for it to go back up to $16,000. But that precludes it from being a currency, because I as a vendor, I need to be able to know tomorrow what it's going to be worth to set my prices. I guess, unless, it's like a side thing for me. So I don't understand. Where does a cryptocurrency that does not have the promise of increasing in value, where does it get its value?
That's unclear. And it's, as you suggested also, it's unclear why anybody would want to use it. If we go back to the days when Bitcoin was being used a little bit more as a currency, people have done some work on this, and the bulk of those currency transactions were for illegal goods. And this was being advertised by the Bitcoin people as great because they hate the state, and so anything the state outlaws is wonderful. But the fact that you have this currency that is somewhat useful for buying drugs and buying weapons and other kinds of stuff that happens on the dark web, I think, is not very attractive to most people. And so then you wonder, what's the point? So far the cryptocurrencies, because they hate middlemen so much, they hate all the services that middlemen provide, right? They love to attack Visa and MasterCard, for example, because they have transaction fees. but Visa and MasterCard have all kinds of fraud protection and chargebacks. It's pretty funny to get in the Bitcoin communities and read about chargebacks. You and I might think chargeback protection is a terrific thing. If somebody steals my card and spends $10,000, I don't owe the money for it, right? Whereas if somebody steals my $10,000 worth of Bitcoin, that's it. And I think that's a value add that I am somewhat pleased that I have to pay a little bit of a transaction fee toward. But the Bitcoin people think, it's a demonic.
Is it possible to have a cryptocurrency that is not conceived in right-wing ideology?
To me, the problem is that the model itself is built in this kind of right-wing ideology because it is so hostile to government and so believing that a kind of absolute free market is going to, the invisible hand of that absolute free market is going to produce a ethical and just society. I just don't think that's true. And I don't even think a real left anarchist would want to believe that that's true because there's such a pre-built-in free market aspect to it. Could there people want cryptocurrencies to be available across the political spectrum? I'm not always convinced by these efforts, but they have, there have been some interesting ideas about trying to peg a currency to labor, more like direct work hours or altruistic actions that you take in the world. These are all really, there are some people working on money, right? Ann Pettifor is a person who writes about money. There are ideas that we might alter some of the basis that through which money is created. And I think those are very interesting ideas. I'd still probably rather see us implement them as a society and make a decision through our democratic institutions to do that than I would to have some ad hoc hacker system of people who just go and build their own system and tell us it's great. Now, that really will require a lot of people to start using it, so there is a somewhat of a democratic aspect to it. But I still think we are, for the most part, with such a central issue as money, we're better off going through the institutions we have built to handle those things.
Well, the politics of Bitcoin, David Golumbia, I feel like this is just chapter 1 for us in terms of exploring this. It is an extremely contentious topic. And it's one of those topics where I feel like everyone feels that no one else gets it. And, and perhaps that is also, look, money itself is a very difficult concept that people have. There's a lot of controversy about, even with a currency that we use every day. And so it makes sense that there is a lot of different perspectives on this, but I certainly appreciate yours. The book is The Politics of Bitcoin, Software as Right-Wing Extremism, and we will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.